Sold. The word landed like a pistol shot across the grand dining hall of Dunhaven Park, while 43 guests sat frozen between mouthfuls of roasted venison and buttered asparagus. Solicitor Aldrin Haskell stood near the entrance doors holding a leather folio stamped with the royal seal of conveyance, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. The entirety of Dunhaven Park, including its grounds, tenant holdings, stables, and surrounding farmland, has been lawfully transferred as of this morning. Duke Calder Ashworth rose so violently from the head of the table that his crystal wine glass shattered against the marble floor. Red wine bled across the white stone like a wound opening beneath his boots. That is impossible. No one holds authority over this estate except me. The solicitor did not flinch. The estate was purchased 17 years ago using the Pemberton dowry, Your Grace. Ownership was registered solely under the name of Her Grace, Duchess Evelina Ashworth. She has exercised her legal right of sale. Silence swallowed the room completely. 43 faces turned slowly toward the far end of the dining table where Evelina sat perfectly still, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her expression carrying nothing except quiet composure. Beside Calder, a woman gasped sharply, "Les Saravain?" Draped in violet silk and wearing emeralds that had once belonged to Evelina's private collection, stared down the table with visible panic tightening across her painted features. She reached instinctively for Calder's arm, but the Duke pulled away without looking at her. "What have you done?" Calder's voice dropped dangerously low as his eyes locked onto his wife. Evelina lifted her gaze slowly. For the first time in years, there was no apology behind her eyes, no submission, no fear. "Exactly what you taught me, Your Grace. I made a decision about my own property without consulting anyone beneath its value." The entire dining hall erupted into whispers while servants exchanged stunned glances from the doorways. Lady Morwenna Ashworth, the Dowager Duchess and Calder's mother, gripped the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white beneath her gloves. Her lips parted but no words followed. Even she, who had orchestrated quiet humiliations against Evelina for nearly 2 decades, could not find language for what had just happened. And across the dining hall, standing near the farthest window with firelight catching the edge of his jaw, a man watched the entire scene unfold without surprise. His name was Lord Casarin Whitmore, and he had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone in the room could possibly understand. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and powerful revenge, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support the channel, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now let us see how everything began. Dunhaven Park had once been considered the most admired estate in the northern counties of England. Its stone walls stretched endlessly across green hills dotted with ancient oak trees, while ivy climbed the eastern towers in thick curtains of dark green that shivered whenever wind rolled across the grounds. Inside, corridors lined with oil portraits of former Ashworth dukes led toward enormous rooms filled with polished mahogany furniture, Persian carpets layered across dark wooden floors, and fireplaces tall enough for a grown man to stand inside without bending. The kitchens alone employed 14 workers who began preparing meals before dawn, filling the lower halls with the scent of fresh bread, cinnamon pastries, slow-roasted lamb, and black tea brewed so strong the aroma reached the second floor by sunrise. Every room inside Dunhaven Park functioned because of one woman. Evelina Ashworth managed the estate with the precision of a military general and the patience of someone who had long stopped expecting gratitude. She approved budgets, inspected repairs, settled disputes among tenant farmers, reviewed seasonal planting schedules, organized social gatherings, supervised household staff, and personally oversaw every delivery arriving through the service entrance. By 7 each morning, she had already reviewed correspondence, approved kitchen menus, and confirmed that fresh flowers had been placed inside every receiving room before visitors arrived. Nobody thanked her for any of it. Duke Calder Ashworth spent most mornings locked inside his private study reviewing investment portfolios and political correspondence while drinking imported French coffee served by his personal valet, Grenon. On the rare occasions he passed through the main halls before midday, he barely acknowledged Evelina beyond a distracted nod. Conversations between them had thinned over the years until entire weeks passed where they exchanged nothing more than polite logistics about upcoming events. "You approved the chandelier repairs for the East Ballroom?" Calder asked one morning without lifting his eyes from a letter. 3 weeks ago, Evelina replied calmly while adjusting a flower arrangement near the window. "Good. Lord Pembury visits Saturday." Ensure the dining room seats at least 30. He left the room before she could respond. To the outside world, the Ashworth marriage appeared dignified and stable. Visitors admired the immaculate grounds, praised the exquisite dinners, and complimented Lord Calder's growing influence within Parliament. Nobody looked closely enough to notice that the Duchess ate most meals alone in her private sitting room while her husband dined with political associates. Nobody questioned why her chambers had slowly been relocated from the sunlit corner suite on the second floor to a smaller room near the servants' corridor on the third. Nobody asked why the Duke's social calendar never once included his wife's name beside any public engagement. The staff noticed everything, they always did. Brinley, Evelina's personal maid for 11 years, understood the loneliness better than anyone. She watched her mistress dress each morning in silence, choosing modest gowns in muted grays and dark blues as though deliberately shrinking away from attention. She noticed how Evelina paused outside the Duke's study door some evenings, standing perfectly still for several seconds, listening to muffled conversation or the scratch of a pen against paper before turning away without ever knocking. She saw how letters addressed to Evelina from her late mother's cousins arrived monthly but sat unopened on the writing desk for weeks, as though connection itself had become something Evelina no longer trusted enough to reach for. One December evening, while helping Evelina unfasten her pearl necklaces before bed, Brinley spoke carefully. "You seemed distracted tonight during supper, Your Grace." Evelina smiled faintly into the vanity mirror. "Did I? I thought I performed rather convincingly." The word performed lingered painfully between them. Brinley lowered her eyes and said nothing else, but the ache behind those 5 syllables stayed with her long after she left the room. Meanwhile, Dowager Duchess Morwenna occupied her position inside Dunhaven Park like a queen who had never abdicated. Despite Evelina holding the title of Duchess for nearly 17 years, Morwenna controlled social decisions, seating arrangements, guest lists, and most critically her son's attention. She corrected Evelina's choices publicly during gatherings with the practiced subtlety of someone who understood that cruelty delivered through a smile was far more devastating than cruelty delivered through open anger. "The lilies were a poor choice for the Bancroft dinner," Morwenna remarked one afternoon while inspecting the main hall alongside a visiting countess. "Roses would have shown better judgment for a family of that standing." Evelina had specifically chosen lilies because Lady Bancroft had mentioned loving them during a previous visit, but she said nothing. She simply nodded and instructed the florist to make the change while the visiting countess glanced between the two women uncomfortably and remained silent. Morwenna's influence extended far beyond flowers. During a private luncheon with several prominent society women the previous spring, she had responded to a casual question about Evelina's health with a carefully measured sigh. "My daughter-in-law prefers solitude. She has always been rather fragile in temperament. Not every woman thrives under the pressures of a household like Dunhaven Park." The words traveled through London drawing rooms within the week. Fragile. The label attached itself to Evelina like a stain she could never scrub away because the woman who applied it did so with a voice full of manufactured concern rather than open malice. That silence was the currency of Dunhaven Park. Everyone who lived inside those walls understood that Evelina carried the weight while others carried the praise. And Evelina had long accepted the arrangement because she believed endurance itself was a form of dignity. But endurance without recognition slowly becomes something else entirely. It becomes disappearance. And nobody inside that estate realized just how close Evelina Ashworth had come to vanishing completely from the life she had built with her own hands. What saved her, strangely enough, were the people nobody else inside the manor ever bothered to notice. Every Tuesday morning, regardless of weather, Evelina walked the tenant grounds carrying a leather satchel filled with remedies, food parcels, and clean linens she had packed herself before breakfast. The tenant families of Dunhaven Park numbered over 60 households scattered across the surrounding farmland, and Evelina knew every single family by name. Old Breslin Thatcher, a widowed farmer with trembling hands and failing eyesight, always waited near his front gate on Tuesday mornings because he knew the Duchess would stop. She brought him jars of honey for the cough that worsened every winter, fresh woolen socks knitted by the kitchen staff, and sometimes simply sat beside him on the wooden bench outside his cottage for half an hour, listening quietly while he spoke about his late wife and the harvests they had shared together decades ago. "You remind me of her," Breslin said one cold morning while fog hung low across the meadows and frost clung to the iron fence posts along the lane. She never walked past someone struggling without stopping either. Avelina squeezed his weathered hand gently and said nothing, because the kindness in his voice was almost too painful to receive when kindness had become so desperately rare inside her own home. Further along the path, the Corwin family had nearly lost their youngest daughter, Emmeline, to scarlet fever the previous autumn. When the local physician refused to travel during 3 days of punishing rain, Avelina had personally written to a doctor in the city, arranged his transport by private carriage, and paid his entire fee from her own household allowance without telling anyone at the manor. She visited the child 3 times during recovery, each time carrying warm broth prepared specially in the estate kitchen and picture books borrowed from the manor library. When Emmeline finally recovered, her mother, Duchess Corwin, wept openly while gripping Avelina's hands at the cottage doorstep, unable to form proper sentences through the emotion. "You saved her life, Your Grace. God knows we could never repay what you have done for this family." Avelina shook her head gently. "You owe me nothing, Duchess. She is a beautiful child." And she fought bravely. She walked away before her own tears could surface publicly, because generosity offered quietly and without expectation was the only language Avelina still trusted completely. And since at Dunhaven Park, her worth had been slowly erased over years of cold indifference and manufactured irrelevance. But among the tenant families, the kitchen workers, the stable hands, and the groundskeepers, she was loved with the kind of loyalty that no title could purchase and no amount of money could replace. Head gardener Sorrel Birch left wildflower bundles outside Avelina's sitting room door every Friday morning, because she had once mentioned preferring them over the formal hothouse roses that filled the main halls. Cook Marin Halsey saved the first warm slice of every fresh loaf for the Duchess, because Avelina visited the kitchen before dawn most mornings to thank the staff personally before breakfast service began. Young stable hand Fenwick always made sure her favorite riding mare, Clover, was brushed and saddled before Avelina even reached the stables for her weekend rides, because she had once spent an entire afternoon helping him splint a foal's injured leg when nobody else was willing to kneel in the mud. These small gestures, accumulated quietly over years, had built something powerful beneath the surface of Dunhaven Park. Loyalty earned through genuine kindness rather than purchased through wealth or commanded through authority. Yet none of it ever reached the ears that mattered most. When Lord Calder hosted political dinners, he praised the estate's management as though it maintained itself by some invisible miracle. When Morwenna entertained visiting nobility, she accepted compliments about Dunhaven Park's beauty and hospitality without once mentioning her daughter-in-law's name. Avelina existed inside the machinery of the household like a vital gear hidden deep beneath a polished surface, invisible, essential, completely unacknowledged. One particularly bitter January evening, Avelina returned from the tenant grounds soaked through from unexpected freezing, rain that had turned the footpaths into rivers of cold mud. Her boots were ruined, her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and her navy woolen cloak dripped steadily onto the stone floor of the service entrance. She had entered through the back to avoid trailing mud across the main halls and found Brinley already waiting with warm towels, dry stockings, and a cup of chamomile tea sweetened with honey. "You will catch your death walking in weather like this, Your Grace," Brinley whispered with genuine worry creasing her brow as she helped peel the soaked gloves from Avelina's reddened hands. Avelina accepted the towel and wrapped it around her shoulders while steam curled upward from the teacup between her frozen fingers. Breslin needed his medicine delivered. The roads were too soft for the cart, and the boy they usually send twisted his ankle yesterday. Brinley studied her mistress carefully. The exhaustion beneath Avelina's eyes had deepened considerably over recent months, carved into her skin like something heavier than sleeplessness, something closer to resignation, or perhaps something even more dangerous than that, something closer to a decision slowly forming behind a lifetime of patience. "Does His Grace know you walk the tenant grounds every week?" Avelina sipped her tea slowly before answering. Her voice carried no bitterness, only a terrible practiced calm. "His Grace does not know what flowers sit on his own dining table, Brinley. I sincerely doubt he tracks my footsteps across muddy farmland." The sadness in those words filled the small service room completely. Brinley turned away to arrange the wet cloak across a drying rack, hiding the emotion tightening painfully across her own face, because she understood something that Avelina had not yet admitted aloud. That the woman standing before her, shivering and soaked and exhausted from walking miles in freezing rain to deliver medicine to a farmer nobody in the manor cared about, deserved more than this life had given her. Far, far more. That same evening, while Avelina changed into dry clothes in her small third-floor room, Laughter echoed faintly from the Duke's private study on the floor below. A woman's laughter, light and musical and entirely unfamiliar. Not a servant, not Morwenna. Someone new. Evelina paused near the top of the staircase, her damp hair still clinging to the back of her neck, and listened. The laughter came again, followed by Calder's voice speaking in a tone she had not heard directed toward her in years. Warm, attentive, genuinely alive with interest. Her chest tightened with something far worse than jealousy, recognition. She had heard that exact voice before, a lifetime ago. It was the voice Calder had once used during their first year of marriage, when he still looked at her across the breakfast table as though her presence mattered more to him than anything else inside the enormous walls of Dunhaven Park. Evelina gripped the banister until her knuckles whitened against the dark wood. Then she released it slowly, straightened her posture, and continued walking toward her room without making a single sound. But something had shifted behind her eyes. Something quiet and unfamiliar and dangerous that nobody inside Dunhaven Park had ever seen before. And by the time her bedroom door closed softly behind her, the woman who had spent nearly 2 decades enduring silence had already begun listening to a very different voice inside herself. The following Sunday, Lord Arland Pembry arrived at Dunhaven Park for a business luncheon with Calder. Pembry was a distant cousin of Evelina's late father and one of the few remaining connections to the Pemberton family name. He had always treated Evelina with quiet warmth during visits, asking about her health and complimenting the estate's condition in ways that clearly credited her efforts rather than ignoring them. That afternoon, Evelina had arranged a beautiful table in the west dining room. Roasted pheasant glazed with rosemary butter, creamed leeks, warm bread rolls dusted with sea salt, and a blackberry tart she had personally requested from Cook Marin after learning it was Pembry's favorite. She had placed fresh wildflowers in the center of the table and ensured every glass sparkled beneath the afternoon light, streaming through the tall windows. When she entered the dining room carrying a final arrangement of napkins, she found Morwenna already seated, adjusting the place settings Evelina had arranged an hour earlier. "I have moved Lord Pembry beside Calder where conversation will flow more naturally. You may sit at the far end." Evelina looked at the rearranged table. Her own seat had been pushed to the very last position, separated from the main group by 3 empty chairs. She nodded without arguing and took her place silently. During the meal, Pembry glanced toward Evelina several times with gentle concern visible in his expression. She smiled politely each time, but the distance between them made conversation nearly impossible over the louder voices dominating the center of the table. After dessert, Evelina excused herself to check on preparations for the evening while Calder and Pembry retreated to the study for cigars and brandy. She was halfway down the corridor when Pembry's voice carried through the partially open study door. "Your wife arranged a remarkable meal today, Calder. The estate has never looked finer. You are fortunate to have a woman of such capability managing your household." A brief silence followed. Then Calder's voice, flat and unbothered, as though commenting on weather rather than his own marriage. "Evelina keeps herself busy. It gives her purpose, I suppose. Without the household tasks, I imagine she would have very little reason to remain here at all." Pembry did not respond immediately. When he spoke again, his tone had cooled noticeably. "That is a remarkably careless thing to say about the woman who brought the Pemberton fortune into this family, Calder." Another silence. Then Morwenna's voice entered the conversation from somewhere inside the room. Evelina had not realized the Dowager Duchess was present. "My son simply means that Evelina has found her place within the household. Not every marriage produces grand passion, Lord Pembry. Some unions serve practical purposes, and there is no shame in acknowledging that honestly." The word struck Evelina's chest like a fist closing around something vital. Practical purposes. 17 years of devotion reduced to 2 words spoken with the casual ease of someone discussing furniture arrangement. She stood frozen in the dim corridor, her fingers pressed against the cold stone wall beside her. For several long seconds she did not breathe. Then Pembry's voice came again, quieter now, but carrying an edge that surprised her. "Her father would have never permitted this, Morwenna. And I suspect you know that as well as I do." Footsteps approached the door. Evelina turned and walked away before anyone could discover her listening. She climbed the staircase to her small 3rd-floor room, closed the door behind her, and sat on the edge of her bed without lighting a single candle. Darkness filled the room around her while something inside her chest that had been bending for years finally began to crack. That night she did not cry. She had moved beyond tears into something quieter and far more dangerous. She sat in perfect stillness until the house fell silent around her, and when dawn finally crept through the narrow window above her writing desk, she opened a drawer she had not touched in years and removed a small leather folder containing the original deed of ownership for Dunhaven Park. She did not read it. She simply held it in her hands for a long time, feeling its weight, before placing it carefully back inside the drawer and closing it slowly. Not yet, but soon. Long before Dunhaven Park became a place of silence and careful endurance, there had been a season when Evelina Pemberton laughed so freely that servants in the corridors would pause their work just to listen. At 20 years old, she moved through her father's estate near the rolling hills of Wiltshire with the kind of unguarded warmth that made everyone around her feel visible. She read poetry aloud during afternoon teas, debated philosophy with her father's academic guests without apology, and spent long summer evenings painting watercolors beside the river that wound through the Pemberton grounds, while her younger brother Haddon threw stones at the water and invented ridiculous stories to make her laugh. She was not considered the most beautiful woman in the county. Society women with sharper features and more fashionable figures drew greater attention at balls and seasonal gatherings. But Evelina possessed something rarer than beauty. She carried an openness in her expression and a gentleness in her voice that made people trust her. Almost immediately, servants confided in her. Neighbors sought her advice. Children followed her through gardens because she always knelt to speak with them at their own height rather than looking down. When Duke Calder Ashworth first arrived at the Pemberton estate for a political dinner hosted by Evelina's father, he was 29 years old, recently titled after his father's death, and visibly exhausted by the weight of sudden responsibility. He spoke carefully throughout the evening, clearly uncomfortable with the attention his new title attracted, and spent most of the dinner listening rather than performing for the guests around him. Evelina noticed him standing alone near the garden terrace after dessert while everyone else gathered around the fireplace for music and conversation. She brought him a cup of tea without being asked and sat beside him on the stone bench overlooking the darkened meadow. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else tonight," she said gently. Calder glanced at her with mild surprise. Most women at these gatherings approached him with rehearsed compliments and obvious ambition. Evelina simply offered tea and honesty. "Is it that obvious?" he asked quietly. Only to someone paying attention, something shifted in his expression. For the first time that evening, the tension across his shoulders eased slightly. They spoke for nearly 2 hours beneath the open sky, while stars appeared slowly above the Wiltshire hills. Evelina asked about his late father. Calder asked about her paintings. Neither mentioned titles, estates, or financial arrangements. By the time the evening ended, Calder had smiled more genuinely than anyone at the gathering had seen from him all night. He returned to the Pemberton estate 4 more times over the following months. Each visit lasted longer than the last. They walked the grounds together, discussing books and music while autumn leaves drifted across the paths around them. He brought her a first edition of her favorite collection of verse, wrapped clumsily in brown paper with a note that read simply, "Because you understand the words better than anyone I have met." Evelina's father, Lord Aldrich Pemberton, approved the match with cautious optimism. Calder seemed steady, intelligent, and most importantly, he seemed to genuinely admire his daughter for the qualities that mattered most. The Pemberton dowry, one of the largest in the region, was used to purchase Dunhaven Park outright, and the deed was placed solely in Evelina's name, as her father's one immovable condition. "This estate belongs to my daughter," Lord Pemberton told Calder directly during the final arrangement meeting. "It is her security, not a gift to your family name." Calder agreed without hesitation. At the time, it seemed unnecessary. He loved her. The first 2 years of their marriage carried a warmth that Evelina would later recall, with a pain so sharp it felt physical. Calder brought her breakfast in bed on Sunday mornings. He read aloud to her beside the fireplace on winter evenings while snow piled against the windows of Dunhaven Park. He held her hand during walks across the grounds and introduced her proudly before every guest who visited the estate. When she laughed, his entire face changed, softening into something unguarded and completely genuine. Then Morwenna arrived. The Dowager Duchess had initially remained at the family's smaller London residence after Calder's marriage, allowing the young couple privacy during their first year. But 18 months after the wedding, she appeared at Dunhaven Park carrying 6 trunks, 2 personal maids, and the announcement that London air no longer agreed with her health. She never left. The erosion began so gradually that Evelina did not recognize it as deliberate for nearly 3 years. Morwenna inserted herself into household decisions with gentle suggestions that slowly became firm expectations. She rearranged seating charts Avelina had prepared. She redirected servants who answered to the Duchess toward tasks she considered more appropriate. She spoke privately with Calder for hours inside the study, and afterward his demeanor toward Avelina would shift almost imperceptibly. He became slightly more formal, slightly more distant, slightly less likely to reach for her hand. "Your wife is charming," Morwenna told Calder one evening when she believed Avelina could not hear. "But charm does not maintain a legacy, Calder. This family requires strength." The implication settled into Calder's mind like slow poison. Over the following years, his warmth withdrew inch by inch. The Sunday morning breakfasts stopped. The evening readings ended. The hand that once reached for hers across the dinner table now rested on political correspondence instead. By their 5th year of marriage, Avelina realized with devastating clarity that the man she had married beneath the stars in Wiltshire no longer existed inside the walls of Dunhaven Park. Morwenna had not stolen him violently. She had simply rebuilt him slowly, replacing every gentle impulse with duty, every affection with expectation, until the man who once wrapped poetry in brown paper could no longer remember why he had ever bothered. And the cruelest part was that Avelina had watched it happen, year after year, understanding exactly what was being taken from her but unable to stop it because the thief wore a mother's face and spoke with a mother's authority that Calder would never question. By their 10th year, they slept in separate rooms. By their 12th, they no longer spoke at meals unless guests were present. By their 15th, Avelina had stopped expecting anything to change and had quietly redirected every ounce of love she once gave her husband toward the people and land that still needed her. But she never forgot what the marriage had been before it was hollowed out from within. And that memory, preserved perfectly inside her like a photograph locked behind glass, became both the source of her deepest grief and the quiet fuel for something that had not yet revealed itself. The woman whose laughter had echoed from the Duke's study that January evening was named Lysara Vane, and she arrived at Dunhaven Park the way a storm arrives on a coastline, not all at once, but in slow pressure changes that made the air feel wrong long before the first rain fell. Lysara first appeared at a political dinner hosted by Calder in late autumn. She accompanied Lord Fenmore, a minor politician from the eastern counties, as his widowed niece seeking introduction to broader London society. She was 26 years old, extraordinarily beautiful, and possessed the kind of effortless confidence that made every room she entered feel slightly smaller. Her dark auburn hair caught candlelight like polished copper, and her green eyes carried an intensity that drew attention whether she intended it or not. Calder noticed her immediately. Throughout the evening, Lysara spoke intelligently about parliamentary reform, laughed at precisely the right moments during conversation, and complimented Dunhaven Park's architecture with the kind of specific detail that suggested she had studied the estate before arriving. She praised the gardens. She admired the library. She asked Calder thoughtful questions about his political ambitions with an attentiveness that bordered on devotion. "What a remarkable woman," Morwenna murmured to her son after Lysara departed that evening. "Intelligent and well-spoken. One rarely encounters such quality among younger women these days." The comment meant nothing at the time. Within weeks, it meant everything. Lysara began visiting Dunhaven Park with increasing regularity, first as a guest at larger gatherings, then at smaller dinners. Then for afternoon tea with Morwenna, who had apparently discovered a sudden and suspicious enthusiasm for the young woman's company. Each visit placed Lysara closer to Calder's attention, while Avelina's presence receded further into the background of her own household. The staff noticed the shift before anyone else. Grennan, the Duke's valet, began receiving instructions to prepare an additional place setting beside his grace at meals whenever Miss Vane visited. Kitchen workers whispered about the expensive French wines Calder suddenly ordered specifically for evenings when Lysara dined at the estate. Brinley noticed that Morwenna had begun personally selecting flower arrangements for the guest rooms on days when the young woman was expected, something the Dowager Duchess had never once done for any other visitor in all the years Avelina had lived at the estate. Avelina observed everything with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years reading rooms more carefully than books. She saw how Calder's posture changed whenever Lysara entered. She noticed how his eyes followed the younger woman across the dining hall while his wife sat 3 chairs away in her usual muted gown. She recognized the way Morwenna subtly redirected conversation toward Lysara's accomplishments whenever Avelina attempted to speak during gatherings. One evening after a particularly painful dinner where Calder had laughed openly at Lasara's stories while ignoring Avelina's single contribution to the conversation entirely, Brinley found her mistress standing alone in the darkened music room, staring at the piano she had not played in over a decade. "You do not have to endure this, Your Grace," Brinley whispered from the doorway. Avelina's fingers rested lightly on the closed piano lid. She did not turn around. "Endurance is the only thing I have left that belongs entirely to me, Brinley." The breaking point arrived 6 weeks later on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Avelina returned from her weekly visit to the tenant grounds carrying her leather satchel and a bundle of dried herbs Breslin had insisted she take from his garden. She entered through the main hall rather than the service entrance because rain had flooded the back path, and immediately noticed something wrong. 2 servants were carrying her personal belongings down the main staircase: her writing desk, her watercolor supplies, the small framed portrait of her late parents that had hung above her bed since her wedding day. Avelina stopped walking. "What is happening?" The servants froze, clearly terrified. Neither could meet her eyes. "His Grace instructed us this morning, Your Grace. The 3rd-floor room is being prepared for Miss Vane's extended stay. Your belongings are being moved to the East Wing." The East Wing, the section of the manor used for temporary storage and overflow servants' quarters during large gatherings. A room with no fireplace, no writing desk, and a single narrow window overlooking the coal shed. Avelina stared at the portrait of her parents balanced carefully in the young servant's trembling hands. Her mother's painted eyes looked back at her with an expression that seemed to carry knowledge of this exact moment, as though Eleanor Pemberton had somehow foreseen the day her daughter's own bedroom would be emptied to make room for her husband's mistress. For several long seconds, Avelina said nothing. The corridor remained silent except for the sound of rain hammering against the windows and the nervous breathing of 2 servants waiting for permission to continue destroying the last private space she had left inside her own home. Then she spoke. Her voice was perfectly calm. "Place everything in the East Wing as instructed. Handle the portrait carefully, please." She walked past them without looking back, descended the staircase, crossed the entrance hall, and stepped directly outside into the pouring rain. She did not take a coat. She did not tell anyone where she was going. Brinley found her 40 minutes later standing motionless beside the stone wall, at the edge of the estate grounds, soaked completely through, staring across the empty farmland stretching toward the gray horizon. Rain streamed down her face in lines that made it impossible to tell where the water ended and tears began. "Your Grace, please come inside. You will fall ill standing here." Avelina did not move. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different, quieter than Brinley had ever heard, but somehow harder underneath. Like a river that had frozen solid overnight, "He gave her my room, Brinley. The room where I wrote letters to my mother before she died. The room where I kept my father's portrait beside my bed so his face was the last thing I saw before I slept. He emptied it like clearing storage space for new furniture." Brinley felt tears burning behind her own eyes but forced herself to remain steady. "What will you do?" The question hung in the rain between them for what felt like a very long time. Then Avelina turned slowly and looked at her maid with an expression Brinley had never seen before. Not sadness, not resignation. Something entirely new had surfaced behind those dark eyes. Something patient and deliberate and absolutely certain of itself. "I will do exactly what needs to be done, but not yet, not until the moment is perfect." She walked back toward the manor without another word, leaving Brinley standing alone in the rain with a chill running through her body that had nothing to do with the cold. Inside the estate, the sound of Lysara's laughter drifted down from the 3rd floor, from the room that had belonged to the Duchess until that morning. And somewhere beneath the polished floors and painted ceilings of Dunhaven Park, something invisible and irreversible had already begun to move. The name Lord Casarin Whitmore carried weight in England the way ancient stone carries weather, quietly, permanently, and with a force that most people only understood after standing too close. His family's shipping empire controlled trade routes stretching from Liverpool to the eastern Mediterranean, while his estates in Devon and Cornwall generated income that made even established aristocratic families speak his name with careful respect. Politicians courted his endorsement. Bankers handled his accounts with nervous precision. Society mothers studied his movements through London with the strategic intensity of military generals planning a campaign. Yet Casarin himself remained almost entirely absent from the world that obsessed over him. At 41 years old, he attended fewer social events than most reclusive widows. Invitations to royal banquets, parliamentary dinners, and seasonal balls accumulated unopened across his desk at Harrowden Hall, his fortress-like estate perched above the Devon cliffs where Atlantic winds battered the windows 9 months of the year. When he arrived at Dunhaven Park one evening in late autumn for a business discussion with Duke Calder Ashworth regarding shared shipping investments, the atmosphere inside the manor shifted as though someone had opened a window during a storm. Servants straightened their posture the moment his carriage appeared on the front drive. Morwenna adjusted her pearl necklace twice before entering the drawing room. Even Calder, who rarely showed deference toward anyone, stood from his chair to greet Casarin personally at the entrance hall, rather than waiting to receive him seated. Lysara watched the arrival from the top of the staircase with sharpened interest. She had heard the name Whitmore discussed among ambitious women in London drawing rooms the way sailors discuss dangerous coastlines. Fascinating from a distance, treacherous up close, throughout dinner, Casarin spoke with careful economy. He answered questions about his shipping routes without revealing strategy. He discussed Parliament without declaring allegiance. He complimented the meal without flattering anyone specifically. His dark gray eyes moved across the table with the steady attention of someone who had long ago learned that observation revealed far more than conversation. Lysara attempted engagement twice during the evening, leaning toward him with practiced warmth while asking about his estates in Devon. Casarin answered politely both times without once looking directly at her face. The dismissal was so subtle that only someone watching carefully would have noticed it. Evelina noticed it. She sat at the lowest seat of the table in her usual position of irrelevance, eating quietly while conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. She had not spoken once during the entire meal. Yet when she glanced briefly toward Casarin during a lull between courses, she found his eyes already resting on her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not pity, not curiosity, something closer to recognition. He looked away before she could understand what it meant. But the weight of that glance lingered against her skin long after dessert was cleared and the evening ended. Later that night, while the manor settled into its usual quiet, Casarin stood alone in the entrance hall waiting for his carriage to be brought around. A grandfather clock ticked steadily beside the main staircase while candles guttered low in their sconces. Through the open doorway of the dining room, he could still see servants clearing the last of the plates under Evelina's quiet direction. She moved among them with an ease that spoke of genuine familiarity rather than authority. She called each one by name. She carried plates herself when a younger maid struggled beneath a heavy tray. She paused to ask the head footman about his wife's recovery from illness before continuing to the kitchen. Nobody asked her to do any of it. Nobody expected it. Casarin turned away before she noticed him watching. Something uncomfortable had lodged itself beneath his composure, and he did not yet know what to call it. The story of Casarin Whitmore's wound was not spoken about openly in polite society, though everyone knew its shape. 7 years earlier, he had married Lady Dorothea Vellicott in a ceremony so lavish that newspapers devoted entire pages to describing the flower arrangements alone. Dorothea was breathtaking, tall, sharp-featured, and possessed of a confidence so magnetic that men frequently lost track of their own sentences while speaking to her. Society called her the diamond of her generation, and Casarin believed he was the most fortunate man alive to have won her. For 18 months, the marriage appeared golden from the outside. They attended operas together. They hosted extravagant dinners at Harrowden Hall, where Dorothea charmed visiting politicians and aristocrats with effortless brilliance. Casarin trusted her completely, not because he was naive, but because the alternative seemed impossible. How could someone so openly devoted be anything other than genuine? The truth arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when Casarin returned unexpectedly early from a business trip to find Dorothea's private sitting room locked from the inside. The maid who answered his knock looked terrified. Behind the door, a man's voice went suddenly silent. The affair had lasted nearly a year. Lord Greaves Ashby, a charming but deeply indebted aristocrat, had been visiting Harrowden Hall during every one of Casarin's business absences. Servants had known for months but feared dismissal too greatly to speak. The confrontation happened privately in Casarin's study that evening. Dorothea did not cry, she did not apologize. She sat in the leather chair across from him with her legs crossed and her expression carrying nothing, resembling remorse. You were stability, Casarin. Greaves is excitement. Surely you understand the difference. The calmness in her voice destroyed something inside him more completely than rage ever could have. She spoke about their marriage the way someone might discuss choosing between two horses, practical, dispassionate. as though his heart was simply a factor she had weighed and found insufficient. The separation was handled quietly through solicitors, but gossip moved faster than legal documents. Within weeks, London society buzzed with whispered accounts that grew more embellished with every retelling. Women pitied him publicly while privately calculating whether his newfound availability made him a more attractive prospect. Men offered sympathetic handshakes that barely concealed amusement. What wounded Kasserine deepest was not the betrayal itself, but the performance that had preceded it. 18 months of fabricated devotion. 18 months of smiles across dinner tables that meant nothing. 18 months of a woman studying him carefully enough to imitate love with terrifying precision. Afterward, he retreated to Harrowden Hall and closed the doors against society almost entirely. He focused on shipping contracts, estate management, and political correspondence conducted exclusively through letters. Women pursued him relentlessly through every channel available. Ambitious mothers arranged chance encounters at the rare events he attended. Beautiful young women laughed too loudly around him, touched his arm during conversation, and praised his wealth with transparent calculation. Kasserine responded to all of it with the same immovable courtesy, polite, distant, completely unreachable. His longtime steward, Barnabas Crewe, watched the withdrawal with growing concern over the years. One evening, after Kasserine had declined yet another royal invitation, Barnabas spoke carefully while pouring brandy beside the study fireplace. "You cannot spend the remainder of your life trusting no one, my lord." Kasserine stared into the fire without blinking. "I trust you, Barnabas. I trust my ships. I trust the tide tables. Beyond that, I have found the world rather unreliable." The sadness behind those words was so controlled that it almost sounded like indifference. But Barnabas had served the Whitmore family for 34 years, and he recognized the difference between a man who felt nothing and a man who had simply decided that feeling was no longer safe. When the business invitation arrived from Duke called Ashworth regarding shared shipping investments through the northern ports, Kasserine nearly declined as usual. But the Ashworth routes intersected with 3 of his most profitable trade lines, and ignoring the opportunity entirely would have been commercially irresponsible. He agreed to attend one dinner, nothing more. He did not expect to notice anyone. The moment that changed everything happened so quietly that most people in the room missed it entirely. During the final course of that autumn dinner at Dunhaven Park, a young kitchen maid carrying a heavy silver tureen of soup stumbled near the edge of the dining table. Hot liquid splashed across the white tablecloth and spattered the sleeve of Morwenna's cream-colored gown. The Dowager Duchess recoiled with visible fury. "Clumsy girl, remove yourself immediately." The maid's face crumpled with terror. Her hands shook so violently that the tureen rattled against the serving tray she still gripped. Several guests looked away in discomfort while Lysara covered a smirk behind her wineglass. Calder continued eating as though nothing had happened. Evelina rose from her chair immediately. She crossed the dining room calmly, took the tureen gently from the girl's trembling hands, and placed it securely on the sideboard. Then she crouched slightly to meet the maid's eyes directly. "It is only soup," she said softly. "No harm done. Go to the kitchen and have Cook Marin pour you something warm to drink. I will finish serving." The girl stared at her with wide, grateful eyes before hurrying from the room. Evelina then turned toward the table, lifted the serving ladle, and calmly distributed the remaining soup among the guests as though nothing unusual had occurred. She did not glance at Morwenna. She did not seek acknowledgement from anyone. From across the table, Kasserine watched the entire scene without moving. His spoon rested untouched beside his bowl. Something had tightened behind his ribs with a force that caught him completely off guard. Dorothea would have joined the laughter. Every woman he had encountered since his separations would have ignored the girl entirely or used the moment to perform visible sympathy for the audience around them. Evelina had done neither. She had simply acted without calculation, without performance, because kindness was not something she displayed. It was something she was. For the remainder of the evening, Kasserine found himself unable to stop observing her. He noticed how she refilled glasses for guests seated near her without being asked. He noticed how she thanked servants by name each time they cleared a plate. He noticed the precise moment her expression tightened almost invisibly when Lysara placed her hand on Calder's arm and laughed at something that was not remotely amusing. Most painfully, he noticed that no one at the table noticed her at all. After the guests departed, Kasserine lingered in the entrance hall longer than necessary, while pretending to examine a portrait near the main staircase. He waited until Evelina passed through the corridor carrying an armful of folded napkins toward the linen closet. "Your Grace," he said quietly. Evelina stopped and turned, clearly surprised that anyone was still present in the hall, let alone addressing her directly. "The soup was excellent this evening. Please extend my compliments to your kitchen staff." Evelina studied him for a brief moment. Then a faint smile crossed her face, the first genuine warmth Catherine had seen from anyone all evening. "I shall tell Cook Marin. She will be delighted to hear it." She continued walking. Catherine watched her disappear around the corner with the napkins still balanced perfectly. In her arms, then, he turned toward the front doors where his carriage waited in the cold night air. Inside the carriage, he sat in silence for a long time before speaking. "Barnabas." "Yes, my lord. Find out everything you can about Duchess Ashworth, her family, her history, the terms of her marriage." The steward raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. As the carriage rolled away from Dunhaven Park beneath a sky filled with cold October stars, something that had been frozen inside Catherine Whitmore for 7 years began to shift, not with warmth, not yet, but with the faint, dangerous possibility that warmth might still exist somewhere in a world he had written off entirely. Over the following weeks, Lord Catherine Whitmore returned to Dunhaven Park 4 times. Each visit was framed around shipping business with Calder. But the conversations extended longer than any commercial discussion required, and Catherine's attention during meals and gatherings consistently drifted toward the quiet end of the table where Evelina sat. At first, nobody took particular notice. Calder assumed the visits reflected genuine investment interest and preened accordingly, hosting increasingly elaborate dinners and inviting influential associates to impress his wealthy guest. Morwenna saw opportunity and immediately attempted to redirect Catherine's attention toward Lysara, seating the younger woman beside him at every gathering and engineering conversations that showcased her intelligence and beauty. Lysara played her part eagerly. She wore her finest gowns during Catherine's visits. She quoted political commentary she had clearly memorized beforehand. She laughed at his rare remarks with an enthusiasm calibrated to suggest deep admiration. Catherine treated her with the same polite indifference he extended to wallpaper. The tension inside the manor sharpened considerably after Catherine's second visit. One evening, Calder intercepted Evelina in the corridor outside her East Wing room with an expression she had not seen from him in years, not indifference, anger. "What precisely is your relationship with Lord Whitmore?" Evelina studied her husband's face carefully. The question carried something beneath its surface that surprised her, not concern for propriety, possessiveness. The same man who had given her bedroom to another woman now stood before her demanding accountability for a conversation she had held across a dinner table. "He is your business associate, Calder. I spoke perhaps 12 sentences to him across 2 evenings. If that constitutes a relationship, then I have deeper ones with the kitchen staff." Calder's jaw tightened visibly. "Do not embarrass this family by appearing desperate for attention. Evelina." The cruelty of the accusation might have destroyed her 3 months earlier. Instead, something inside her recognized it for exactly what it was. Fear. Calder feared losing control over something he had already thrown away. Not because he valued it, but because he could not bear the idea of someone else recognizing its worth. She said nothing in response. She simply walked past him toward her room, and for the first time in their marriage, she was the one who closed the door without looking back. The first sign of trouble came during his 3rd visit, when Catherine asked Evelina directly across the dinner table whether she still painted watercolors. The question landed in the middle of a conversation about tariff legislation and silenced the table entirely. Evelina looked up with visible surprise. "I have not painted in many years, my lord. That is unfortunate. The landscapes of this county deserve someone who sees them properly." The compliment was quiet but unmistakable. Morwenna's eyes narrowed sharply. Lysara's smile froze. Calder set down his wineglass with a controlled movement that betrayed more irritation than he intended. After dinner, Morwenna intercepted Catherine in the drawing room with manufactured warmth. "Lord Whitmore, Lysara was just mentioning how fascinated she is by maritime commerce. Perhaps you might share some insights over tea." Catherine regarded the Dowager Duchess with an expression that revealed nothing. "I appreciate the suggestion, Lady Ashworth. However, I believe I shall take a walk through the grounds before departing. Your daughter-in-law mentioned the gardens are particularly beautiful in autumn." He excused himself before Morwenna could respond. Through the drawing room window, Lysara watched him walk across the darkened grounds alone, and for the first time since arriving at Dunhaven Park, uncertainty flickered across her confident expression. That night, after the guests had departed, Morwenna summoned Lysara to the private sitting room on the 2nd floor. The fire burned low while both women sat across from each other with untouched glasses of sherry between them. "He is not responding to you," Morwenna stated bluntly. Lysara's composure cracked slightly. "He barely speaks to anyone. It is not personal. It is very personal." Morwenna's voice carried the sharp precision of a woman who had spent decades studying the architecture of influence. "He asked Avelina about her paintings. He did not ask you a single direct question all evening." Lysara stared into the fire without answering. Morwenna leaned forward. "If Lord Whitmore develops genuine interest in Avelina, everything we have built here unravels. Calder's pride will not survive the public humiliation, and neither will your position inside this household." The threat was clear. Lysara's comfort, her status, her access to the Ashworth name and fortune depended entirely on Avelina remaining invisible. If someone as powerful as Catherine Whitmore suddenly made her visible, the entire arrangement collapsed. "What would you have me do?" Lysara asked quietly. Morwenna sipped her sherry slowly. "Nothing dramatic. Simply ensure that Avelina continues to appear exactly as society already believes she is. Fragile, uninteresting, beneath notice." The alliance between the two women solidified that evening into something calculated and deliberate. Over the following weeks, Lysara began dropping carefully worded comments about Avelina during social gatherings. She mentioned the Duchess's fragile constitution to visiting ladies. She sighed sympathetically when Avelina's name arose in conversation, implying without stating that the older woman suffered from nervous complaints that prevented her from participating fully in society. The whispers spread through drawing rooms and tea parlors with devastating efficiency. Meanwhile, something was happening that nobody inside the manor suspected. 3 days after Catherine's second visit, Avelina had quietly written a letter to Solicitor Aldrin Haskell in London. The letter requested a private consultation regarding the legal terms of property ownership established through dowry arrangements. She posted it herself during her Tuesday walk to the tenant grounds, using the village post office rather than the estate's own mail service. Haskell responded within the week. The consultation was arranged for a Tuesday afternoon when Avelina could travel under the cover of her regular tenant visits without raising suspicion. Brinley accompanied her, carrying the leather satchel filled with remedies as usual so that anyone who noticed their departure would assume nothing unusual. Inside the solicitor's modest office in the nearby market town, Avelina placed the original deed of Dunhaven Park on the desk between them. "I wish to understand my rights regarding this property completely," she said calmly, "and then I wish to discuss the process of selling it." Haskell studied the documents carefully. His eyebrows rose once, then settled. "The deed is clear, Your Grace. The property is yours entirely. Your husband has no legal claim to prevent a sale." Avelina nodded slowly. "Then we shall proceed. But I require absolute discretion. No one at the estate is to know until the transaction is complete." The solicitor agreed. Over the following weeks, while Morwenna arranged flowers for Lysara's visits and Calder expanded his political dinner calendar, Avelina quietly assembled every document required for the largest private property sale in the northern counties that year. She told no one except Brinley, and Brinley, loyal beyond question, guarded the secret with her life. The backlash inside the manor intensified during this same period, though those inflicting it had no idea they were accelerating their own. Destruction. Morwenna began openly referring to Lysara as the lady of the house during conversations with visiting nobility. Calder stopped inviting Avelina to any social engagements entirely, instructing Grennan to inform her that her presence was no longer expected at political dinners. Lysara grew bolder. She rearranged furniture in the main drawing room without consulting Avelina. She instructed kitchen staff to change the weekly menus. She complained to Morwenna about the quality of linens in her third-floor room, the room that had belonged to Avelina until weeks earlier, and fresh silk bedding was ordered from London within the day. One afternoon, Avelina entered the library to retrieve a book and found Lysara seated in her father's reading chair, the only piece of furniture Avelina had brought from the Pemberton estate after her father's death. Lysara looked up without embarrassment. "Oh, I hope you do not mind. This chair is wonderfully comfortable." Avelina looked at the chair where her father had read to her as a child, where she had sat during her darkest evenings at Dunhaven Park, drawing strength from the memory of his voice and the faint scent of pipe tobacco that still clung to the leather after all these years. "Not at all," Avelina replied evenly. "Enjoy it while you can." Lysara frowned slightly at the phrasing but dismissed it with a wave of her hand. That evening, Avelina met with Solicitor Haskell for the final time. The buyer had been secured. The paperwork was complete. All that remained was her signature and the selection of a date. The buyer, as it happened, was Lord Casarin Whitmore. Barnabas Crew had discreetly informed Casarin of the potential sale after learning through legal channels that the Dunhaven Park deed was being prepared for transfer. Casarin had made his offer within 24 hours. The price was generous. The terms were clean, and most importantly, the transaction was structured to ensure that every penny of the sale transferred directly and exclusively to Evelina Ashworth, with no portion accessible to the Duke or the Ashworth family name. When Haskell informed Evelina of the buyer's identity, she paused for a very long time before responding. "Lord Whitmore understands the consequences of this purchase for the Ashworth family?" "He does, Your Grace. He was quite specific in his instructions. He said, and I quote, that he wished to ensure the estate remained in the hands of someone who understood its true value. He believes that person is you, not the Duke." Evelina signed the papers that afternoon. Her hand did not tremble once. The evening of the grand dinner arrived beneath skies heavy with the threat of late autumn storms. Dunhaven Park blazed with candlelight from every window as 43 guests filled the dining hall for what Calder had organized as a celebration of his newest political alliance. Roasted venison, braised lamb, creamed potatoes, honeyed carrots, fresh oysters on silver trays, and 3 varieties of imported wine covered the long table beneath enormous crystal chandeliers that scattered light across the polished marble floor. Lycerus sat proudly at Calder's right hand, wearing violet silk and the emerald necklace that had once belonged to Evelina's private collection, a piece Morwenna had quietly removed from Evelina's jewelry case weeks earlier and presented to Lysara as a gift from the family. Morwenna occupied her usual position of authority near the center of the table, her silver hair pinned beneath a diamond comb, surveying the room with the satisfied expression of a woman who believed she had finally arranged everything exactly as it should be. Evelina sat at the far end of the table in a simple dark blue gown. She ate slowly, she spoke to no one, and she watched the clock on the mantelpiece with the calm patience of someone who knew precisely what was coming and precisely when it would arrive. At exactly 9 o'clock, the enormous dining hall doors opened. Solicitor Aldrin Haskell entered carrying the leather folio. Behind him, 2 legal clerks stood as witnesses. The room fell silent as Haskell's measured footsteps crossed the marble floor. Calder looked up with mild irritation. What is the meaning of this interruption? Haskell stopped beside the head of the table and spoke clearly enough for every guest to hear. "I am here on a matter of completed legal transfer. Your Grace, the entirety of Dunhaven Park, including its grounds, tenant holdings, stables, and surrounding farmland, has been lawfully transferred as of this morning." Everything happened exactly as it had been set in motion. Calder's glass shattering against the marble, Lysara's sharp gasp cutting through the silence, Morwenna's white knuckles gripping the armrest until the wood creaked beneath her fingers, and Evelina, unmoved at the lowest seat of the table, delivering the words that would echo through London society for years. "Exactly what you taught me, Your Grace. I made a decision about my own property without consulting anyone beneath its value, but what the hook had not shown was what happened next." After the initial shock subsided and whispers erupted across the dining hall, Casarin Whitmore stepped forward from beside the window, where he had been standing throughout the evening. His voice carried across the room with the quiet authority of a man who had no need to raise it. "If I may address the room briefly." Silence returned immediately. Every face turned toward him. "I am the purchaser of Dunhaven Park. The transaction was conducted entirely at the initiation of Duchess Ashworth, and I agreed without hesitation. Not because I require another estate, but because in every interaction I have witnessed inside this household, only one person has ever demonstrated the character worthy of deciding its fate." Casarin's eyes moved slowly across the room, passing over Morwenna, past Lysara, past Calder, and resting finally on Evelina. "I have watched this woman manage an estate that she received no credit for maintaining. I have watched her feed tenants from her own allowance, while her household spent lavishly on guests who would forget their names by morning. I have watched her protect servants from cruelty while enduring cruelty herself without complaint. I have watched the people who should have valued her most treat her as though she were invisible." Morwenna's face had drained of all color. Lysara's hand had fallen away from Calder's arm entirely. Several guests lowered their eyes in visible discomfort. Casarin continued, his voice steady and unhurried. "Duchess Ashworth did not sell this estate out of revenge. She sold it because she finally understood something that took me far too long to learn myself. That enduring mistreatment is not loyalty. It is not strength, and remaining inside a life that refuses to see you is not dignity. It is disappearance." He paused, and when he spoke again, His tone carried something warmer beneath the composure. "The proceeds of this sale belong entirely to her. She is free to live wherever she chooses. However she chooses, answering to no one who has ever made her feel less than what she is, and what she is, in my estimation, is the finest person I have encountered in a life spent surrounded by people who measure worth in everything except the things that actually matter." For several seconds, nobody in the dining hall moved. Then, from somewhere near the kitchen doorway, a single pair of hands began clapping. Cook Marin Halsey stood in the entrance, tears streaming openly down her flour-dusted cheeks, applauding with fierce pride. Beside her, Brinley joined, then Sorrel the gardener, then Fenwick the stable hand, then Grennan, the Duke's own valet, who set down the serving tray he was holding and brought his hands together slowly while looking directly at the woman who had thanked him by name. Every single morning for 17 years, the servants' applause spread until it filled the doorways and corridors surrounding the dining hall. The people who had truly known Avelina's worth all along were the first to celebrate it openly. Calder stood motionless at the head of a table that no longer belonged to him, his face carrying the expression of a man watching his own reflection crack apart in a mirror. Morwenna had closed her eyes entirely, and Lysara Vane, still wearing stolen emeralds against violet silk, looked around the room with the sudden desperate awareness of someone who had just realized the ground beneath her feet had been sold. Avelina rose from her chair for the last time inside Dunhaven Park. She looked at Catherine with an expression that held no triumph, no bitterness, and no performance, only the quiet, exhausted relief of a woman who had finally stopped disappearing. "Thank you," she said simply. 2 words. But they carried nearly 2 decades of silence breaking open at last. The years that followed reshaped every life that had intersected inside the walls of Dunhaven Park, though none more completely than the lives of those who had believed their positions were permanent. Avelina settled at Briarstone Cottage, a modest but beautiful property near the Wiltshire Hills where she had grown up. She chose it deliberately, not for its size or status, but because the river that wound through its grounds reminded her of the evenings she had spent painting watercolors beside her brother Haddon as a girl. She began painting again that first winter, setting up an easel beside the window where morning light flooded the sitting room in pale gold. She lived simply and generously. She continued visiting families in need, now from her own resources rather than a household allowance controlled by someone else. She funded a small school for tenant children in the village nearby and personally taught reading lessons on Thursday afternoons. She employed Brinley as her companion rather than her maid, and the 2 women shared breakfast each morning at a table where no one sat at the far end alone. Catherine visited Briarstone Cottage regularly throughout that first year. He brought books wrapped in brown paper, a gesture Avelina recognized immediately, though she said nothing about it aloud. They walked the grounds together in long, comfortable silences and spoke during evenings about literature, politics, and the particular weight of learning to trust again after betrayal had made trust feel dangerous. He never rushed, he never presumed, and he never once treated her as someone who needed rescuing. He treated her as someone who had already rescued herself and simply deserved companionship worthy of the life she had chosen. By the following autumn, society understood without announcement that Lord Casarin Whitmore and Duchess Avelina Ashworth had found in each other something neither had expected to find again, not passion performed for audiences, but partnership built on mutual respect, shared wounds, and the quiet recognition that 2 people who had both survived being loved dishonestly were perhaps the only ones capable of loving each other truthfully. Meanwhile, the Ashworth name collapsed under its own hollowness. Without Dunhaven Park's income and without Avelina's management holding the household together, Calder's financial position deteriorated rapidly. Political allies who had once sought his favor distanced themselves after the scandal of the estate sale spread through Parliament and London society. The man who had dismissed his wife as a practical purpose discovered that the practical purpose had been the only thing sustaining his entire world. Lysara Vane departed within 3 months of the sale. She left quietly one morning without farewell, taking the emerald necklace and 2 pieces of silver with her. She reappeared briefly in London society on the arm of another wealthy man before, disappearing from public life entirely. Nobody mourned her absence. Morwenna retreated to the small London residence she had once abandoned, her health declining as rapidly as her influence. The woman who had spent decades controlling her son's marriage now sat alone in an empty drawing room attended by a single maid reviewing invitations that had stopped arriving years ago. Calder aged visibly in ways that had nothing to do with years. He sold investments poorly. He borrowed unwisely. He attended fewer gatherings and spoke less confidently when he did. The man who had once commanded rooms now entered them, hoping not to be noticed. One winter afternoon, nearly 3 years after the sale of Dunhaven Park, a carriage arrived outside Briarstone Cottage carrying a visitor Evelina had not expected. Calder Ashworth stepped down onto the gravel path, looking thinner, grayer, and more uncertain than she had ever seen him. His coat was well made but showing wear, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves. Brinley answered the door and looked at him for a long moment before turning to Evelina, who stood near the fireplace with a paintbrush still in her hand. Evelina did not speak immediately. She studied the man standing in her doorway, the man who had once read poetry to her beneath the stars, who had once held her hand during walks across autumn grounds, who had slowly become someone unrecognizable under the weight of his mother's influence and his own cowardice. Then she set down her brush and gestured toward the chair beside the fire. "Sit down, Calder. You look cold. I will have Brinley bring tea." He sat. He did not apologize immediately because the scale of what required apology seemed to paralyze him. But eventually, after the tea had cooled and the fire had burned low, he spoke. "I did not understand what I had. I know that means nothing now." Evelina looked at him steadily. "It means you understand it. That is not nothing." She did not forgive him that afternoon because forgiveness for 17 years of erasure could not be offered across a single cup of tea. But she did not punish him either. She offered him warmth on a cold day, the way she had always offered warmth to anyone who needed it, because kindness had never been something Evelina performed for reward. It was simply who she was, who she had always been, who she would remain long after every person who had underestimated her had been forced to understand their mistake. And England eventually learned what the walls of Dunhaven Park had witnessed too late. That true worth was never measured in beauty, status, or obedience. It lived in the hands that delivered medicine through freezing rain, in the voice that calmed a frightened servant while a room full of wealth looked away, in the woman who endured years of silence without losing the capacity for kindness, and who, when the moment finally came, did not seek revenge but simply chose herself for the first time in her life. That was the victory, not the sale, not the fortune, not the powerful man's who saw what others refused to see. The victory was a woman sitting beside a river in Wiltshire, painting watercolors in the morning light, finally free, and the quiet truth she carried with her into that freedom was the simplest truth of all. She had always been enough. The only thing that changed was that she finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell her so.